Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Patrick Mayfield and I'm your presenter on this webinar. I'm not sure where you are in the world. It would be good to see on the chat. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, I suppose. I'm here to talk to you about how top flight project managers grow their leadership skills. Well, a little bit about me before we kick off into the substance of this presentation. Let me see. What are my credentials? Well, I've been project managing over the last 4 decades. Yes, I'm old. I started in the public sector, working for government, regional government in the UK, and then the private sector. And then I went freelance as a consultant and eventually set up my own training and consultancy business, working across all sectors as well as internationally. In 1993, I was approached by the UK government. I'd spoken at a conference, a user group conference, to do with a new project management method that the UK government had sponsored called Prince. And they asked me if I would be the private sector representative in the management team that eventually launched something called Prince 2. Prince 2 stands for Projects in a Controlled Environment. And it went global. I think there's evidence of use of Prince 2 all over the world. In 2007, I also had the privilege of being one of the 4 authors on the refresh of managing successful programs, also sponsored by the UK government at that time. And I set up a business in 2001 called Mayfield. It was a training and consultancy organization. I stood down from that as an executive director last year. Unfortunately, this year it went into insolvency. Now, in case you still see the name Pierce Mayfield as an active business, the insolvency agents sold the intangible assets, including the name and the brand of Pierce Mayfield, to another training organization. So if you see that around, it's absolutely nothing to do with me now. In 2013, in response to some research that I had done, and a question I heard in a conference, couldn't we have a really good book for project managers on stakeholder engagement? So I wrote it, Practical People Engagement. An international accrediting body, APMG International, asked if they could use it as the core reference to a new qualification in stakeholder engagement. I was delighted to say yes. I see it used across the globe in a number of countries. 2014, the Change Management Institute published the Change Manager's Handbook, and I was invited to write one of the chapters there on stakeholder strategy. The Change Manager's Handbook is the, if you like, the change management Bible for any practitioner in that area. And then last year I brought out, or rather, yes, last year, not 2017, but 2016, excuse me, I brought out Leading Yourself, really because I was quite concerned with a growing sense of chronic busyness, or overwhelm as it's now being called, within all of my clients and client organizations, a kind of overwhelm that distracted them from doing their best work. So I published that last year. And now I coach and operate the Positive Outlier Academy. More on that later. So what we'll cover in this webinar is a question I want to start with. Are we focusing on the wrong things? Because when it comes to skill development, I'm a little bit concerned that a lot of effort is put into areas that don't actually help us as project managers. Then I'll go on to talk about how we acquire those skills, and what we've identified through research are the key lead skills that we need to attend to in our profession. And I want to end on a note of hope, hope for the rest of us, and offer you a free resource that you can use to take ownership of your own leadership development, if you will. So let's have a look at the first point. Are we focusing on the wrong things? I'm going to introduce you to my grandson, and there he is holding his newly born sister. This was taken a few years ago, and it was about the time that this little lad was diagnosed with, well, the diagnosis at the time was he was at the mild end of the autistic spectrum. So little is known about this thing called autism now that they've even changed the language. They don't talk about an autistic spectrum anymore. And of course, this was a huge shock to us all, to his mum and dad, and to his grandparents, of course. What did we do with this little lad? So I did some research into the characteristics of what we now call autism. And it covers these behavior patterns, poor communication skills. It's almost as if somebody with autism doesn't have that secret thing called empathy. They're not able to read the other person to sit in their shoes. A lot of social etiquette is just over their heads. Compulsive behavior. They appear to follow rules. And in fact, they're at their most comfortable when life is predictable and they can follow a certain pattern. Sameness. They don't like change. They resist change. And this was a big problem for my grandson's parents, because they would often want to go on holiday. But until several years on, he was very resistant to any major change like that. And of course, they wanted to recharge their batteries, and he did not want to go away from home. Also, there's ritualistic behaviors. You'll see in the two photographs here taken from the internet. On the left is a little lad who's ordering cans from a cupboard. On the right, there's a child ordering their toys before they can go to sleep. They can't rest until they have put certain things into order. It's an unvarying pattern of daily behavior. And it's also very restricted behavior, a very limited focused or interest or activity. So when I'm trying to engage with my grandson and I see signs of him wanting to engage, he'd always want to be talking to me about Minecraft, a computer game. And he's changed his favorite computer game now. He's a lot better. He's a teenager now. He's functioning quite well in certain areas. But even so, it's very difficult for him to bring me along and help me understand what Minecraft is all about, or whatever the computer game is. He's rapidly going off and going deep into his limited focus. So at the time he was diagnosed, and as I say, he's a lot better now, I was trying to reassure my son and my daughter-in-law, and I said something shocking. I just came out with it, which was, well, don't worry, he could become a project manager. Now, I apologize to any of you in the audience who have autism in the family. It's not something that we joke about. It's nothing trivial. But if you're offended because you're a project manager, that's probably not you. But just look again at these behaviors. In my consultancy practice, in my coaching, I have found these patterns a lot. There was a received behavior. It was more common, I think, in the last century, early part of my career. But I would find it extraordinary that, for example, project managers would be resistant to change. They would so try and order the private world of the project that any change request was seen as a risk automatically. I think we've come a long way with certain management approaches now. I don't need to mention Agile, there are others as well. But it seems to me a huge and profound paradox where essentially a project is supposed to be a vehicle of change, and yet some of the most change-resistant people often inhabit the project world. Now, you don't have to agree with me about that, but it did raise a question in my own mind, particularly having been deep in methodology, in trying to understand what was best in the practice of project and program management. Now, we can discuss organization aspects, we can discuss team aspects, but here I'm focusing on you and I as the individual. Have we been focusing on the wrong things? Have we been working very hard at areas of our profession that actually haven't got high leverage? I want to propose that there are certain behaviors that do drive high performance in the delivery of projects, even outstanding projects and programs, that lead outstanding change, that has a transformational effect on the organizations that are involved. And I want to reference and draw on some research that I accessed. I'll be talking in a moment about skill acquisition. This came from research by Simon and Hubert Dreyfus in the States some 20 years ago or so. But also David Partington and Sergio Peregrinelli's work at Cranfield into what were the competencies of high-order program managers. They produced some very good work, and Sergio has published a book since. But also some work from Andy Crow across the Atlantic. He wrote a book called Alpha Project Managers, and the findings are really quite out of the ordinary, not what orthodoxy would lead us to expect. Here's the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. You'll see, running from left to right, there are different levels of skill. There's the novice, the advanced beginner, the competent, the proficient, and the expert. If you think of the vertical axis being performance and the horizontal axis being skill development over time, I want to illustrate each of these 5 stages. This is the classic Dreyfus model. I've moderated it somewhat in our Positive Outlier Academy, but if we look at each of these, I'll try and illustrate it with a skill we all understand, which is the skill of riding a bicycle. The Dreyfus brothers identified these levels of skill when they were called in to problem solve for the US Air Force. The US Air Force had a training problem. When in a crisis situation, typically in combat, but not necessarily, they found they were hitting roadblocks with training Air Force pilots. For example, if you're flying a fast jet and you're upside down, you need to know which way is up, unless you pull your plane into a steep climb and end up crashing into the ground. Or what do you do when you suddenly are beginning to lose oxygen, and so on and so on. So they began to track different levels of skill and how people shifted from one level to the other. So the novice level is typified by rigid adherence to rules, little situational perception. In other words, all situations were deemed to be the same to the novice, with no discretionary judgment. They're rule followers, basically. They don't know what to do. The novice says, tell me what to do. Now, in riding a bike, this would be the equivalent of, again, my children when they were preschool, when they were very young, they would have reading books where they'd be able to identify what was a bicycle and what was a motorbike and what was a car and what was a truck. They would be able to tell you what a bicycle was. They would look at a vehicle. Was it a bicycle? Yes or no? But that's purely a knowledge level. We live in what's called a knowledge economy, but it's not necessarily a skill economy. Then there's the advanced beginner. Here, the advanced beginner is looking for guidelines based on the attributes of what they're looking at, the aspects. Are they looking at a risk? How do they regard a risk? How do they weight a risk? They're beginning to develop some situational perception, but it's still fairly limited. And they tend to treat everything as equally important. Every element in their area of work is of equal importance. There's very little prioritizing that's evident. If they're prioritizing at all, it tends to be to what other people are shouting for or what other people are driving them to do. In terms of the skill of riding a bike, this would be the wobbly bike scale. This would be where I introduced my children to a safe area, piece of grass, not many trees around, certainly not a public highway, certainly not a busy one. And I'd take the stabilizers off their bikes and they would wobble around. Their total focus would be on staying upright. Very little steering purposefully. That's the wobbly bike level, that's advanced beginner. The competent level, well, now we're beginning to cope with multi-activities. Note, they don't say multitasking, but they are coping with multiple activities. They're seeing that actually this skill requires an awareness of a number of different things, and some perception, some causal perception of what I do now will have consequences. Consequences that either help me move towards my goal or not. Some deliberate planning, therefore, and they formulate personal routines in terms of their private work world. They're developing their own routines, their own little rituals. So I guess in terms of the skill of riding a bike in the UK, we've got a public assessment standard called Bikeability. It used to be called the Cycling Proficiency Standard. Now, what's interesting about this is it de-risks the rider from themselves. They can now go on a public highway and they know how to signal to other drivers. But there's still possibly a huge risk from other road users. Somebody who's reached this standard hasn't necessarily got the skill of reading the threats of other road users. That's the competent level. The proficient level, well, now we're looking at a whole view. We're looking at a systemic view, holistic view of the situation. We're looking at the Internet of Things. We're looking at consciously prioritizing important aspects. Interestingly, the Dreyfus brothers went on to look at other skill areas like nursing or playing chess. And what they discovered was that at the competent level, competent nurses would identify priorities, whereas proficient nurses would identify the next thing they had to move to, where often at the lower levels, nurses would be trapped in the dilemma, like rabbits in a headlight caught between two emergency situations. They perceive these minor tells, the deviations from the normal pattern. Something is wrong, or something is interesting, or something is promising. And they employ maxims for guidance with meanings that they can adapt. It's a very adaptive skill by now. Finally, I should say the proficient level, in the cycling analogy, that's really equivalent, I would say, to somebody who's just got a job as an urban cycling courier. They're beginning to develop a mental map of the city. They are anticipating threats from other road users. If they see congestion developing ahead, they can reroute themselves on the fly. So the expert level, this is really transcending reliance of rules, guidelines, and maxims. For example, I once saw a black belt martial artist break the rules and win a contest. That's what you can do when you're at the expert level. This is an intuitive grasp of situation. It's a vision of what is possible. Uses analytical approaches, say the Dreyfus brothers, so you might use first principle problem solving if you find yourself in a totally new context. So typically we found expert project managers are able to move across sectors and not only survive but thrive, even though they've had very little experience in those sectors, because they rapidly use these analytical approaches to bring themselves up to speed. So here we have 5 levels. Now, as I've been tracking through that, I've presented this many times to groups, and I guess you're probably mapping your colleagues along this scale, other project managers, other program managers you know. So I'm interested. I wonder, if you think about this, for most learning and development, for most training and so on that we put people's way, what does it make us? Does it make us advanced beginners, competent, proficient, or experts? I'm going to hand over to Hannah now, and she'll ask you to vote on this.
Thank you, Patrick. So I will launch the polls now and leave the audience 30 seconds to vote. Okay, Patrick. So I have the results from the polls. We have 7% for A, 35% for B, 35% for C, and 24% for D.
24% for D, 7% for A.
For A.
Okay, that's very interesting. Well, let's carry on, and I will show you how we have seen this map out. When it comes to conventional training, particularly content-rich training, we've seen it beneficial, obviously, to novices. They need to know the rules, they need to know the processes, they need to know the artifacts. Advanced beginners also benefit from this somewhat, but not quite as much as the novices. Sometimes the competent will benefit, particularly if there's been some kind of regulation change or whatever. But to a large extent, training is pretty limited. When it comes to recruitment, we found that in terms of skills assessment during the recruitment process, most project managers could be recruited even at the advanced beginner level. A few will be recruited at competent. Most organizations will not search for an expert. They might hire one in on occasions to troubleshoot. But how does an advanced beginner move up the levels to become competent or proficient? We found that mentoring is very helpful within an organization, from among their peers, having some kind of accountability relationship. Sometimes it's from the line manager. It's better if it isn't sometimes. But also the practice that can be encouraged by line management of taking risk-limited experiments, practicing, trying things out. Both of these approaches require a relaxation of a kind of legalistic rule-following approach. And indeed, the experimenting and practice goes on right through the higher levels. When we come to the competent level, there's something called deep practice. I've just finished reading an excellent book by an American academic at Georgetown University, Cal Newport, called Deep Work. And his argument is that very rarely in the modern workplace do we get a chance to do truly deep work. We're so distracted all the time. We live in environments where there's a lot of open planning and so on. But he suggests that the paradox here is that whilst organizations almost drive it out, they're really looking for the results of deep work. Also, peer group workshops where people can get together as user groups, whether within a large organization or across organizations, and workshop together with problems. Coaching is often the key. In my practice, it's my aim sometimes to help individuals crack through a problem that they would be unable to solve otherwise, not by giving them the solution, but by equipping them to get through that. But also, not just problem solving, but seeing opportunities, seeing possibilities from their own strengths. When you get to the proficient level, they're looking for the tribe, the group of like-minded, mature individuals, the mature practitioners whom they can trust and they can dialogue with. And at the expert level, really you're looking at fairly exclusive mastermind groups, small groups. I have a friend, for example, who's an exceptional leader, who's just come back from Northern California, where there was a mastermind group of about 40 individuals. It's a large mastermind group. But in that forum, they were able to look at global trends in their particular niche area. And they were also able to share stories and encourage one another and learn from each other. It's one of the ways that experts continue to sharpen the saw. So 35% for advanced beginner, yeah. 35% for competent. I think that's a little on the high side. I certainly wouldn't expect a proficient to get that much out of conventional learning and development solutions. I suspect that experts will occasionally sit on training courses. The outstanding experts will do that. But I think we need to be careful. Training courses as we knew them, content heavy, knowledge intensive, aren't necessarily the means for us to develop our skills. The competent upwards begin to take ownership. They have a pull learning strategy. They will own their own learning, whereas the novice, and to a degree the advanced beginner, will take guidance or even be directed to go on certain training courses. I want to come on then to those key areas, those discriminant areas of the top flight project managers. A few years ago, my colleague John Edmonds and I came across some discussion over the internet, which went like this. What if we could get into the mind of high performers? What if we could find out what their mental crib sheet was, their mental checklist, and we could write it down, we could codify it, we could follow it and get the same results as these high performers? This is classic cognitive psychology, the idea that as you think, you act, and as you act, you get the results. So we decided to test this. Our research question was, among project and program managers, among the high performers, did they have these mental crib sheets? So we conducted this research, which amassed a population of about 200, and most of them were the control group, because we also qualified everybody who joined the research that we should have access to their line managers and we should have access to some of their work results. We wanted to independently validate whether in fact they were high performers. And we had a subset of about 8%, I guess, of high performers that we identified. And as we went through, we found some emergent patterns, some distinctive behaviors. First of all, I should say that as we went through the research, our research question was, do all high performers have the same crib sheet? And the second supplementary question was, is it the same? Well, we were disappointed because yes, they did all have some kind of internal mental checklist, but they were all different. So we looked at the behaviors. And the first one was personal margins. Now I'm using this illustration of this tile game because it's one used by Tom DeMarco in his book Slack. It's the idea that the tile game only works if there's a blank square. So you can shuffle the tiles around and solve the puzzle by sorting all the tiles in order. The game works well. But modern management theory would look at that blank space and say, what a waste, and immediately put another tile in. As soon as you do that, DeMarco says, you freeze the system in its current capability. What we found at the individual level, as we tracked these people over the 6-week period, was looking at their diaries was very illuminating. They all kept back significant amounts of time during their working week. They kept personal margins. As project and program managers, it seemed that they needed this. When we asked them afterwards, when we did the telephone interviews with them and their line managers at the end of the 6 weeks, their basic strategy was to keep time in reserve for the unexpected. The unexpected was the workaday reality of all of our lives as project managers. So what did the majority do? They worked longer, they worked late, they worked weekends, or stuff never got done. It just dropped off the end of their to-do list. Not so with high performers. Second behavior trait we found was that they lent to action. They had a leaning to action. So we were interested to see and to talk to them about how they were using this discretionary time. Part of their desire to keep their personal margin was they wanted to move towards end experiment, as I just suggested, in terms of moving up their skill levels. They wanted to try things out. They wanted to poke the system. The majority control group all tended to be driven. They all tended to have urgent agendas given to them by their project sponsors, their project director, or whoever. They never were able to necessarily impress the initiative on their own project. I say never, they did sometimes, but there was a marked difference in the way that high performers behaved. For example, one of the majority was a portfolio manager from a police authority, someone who oversaw the whole portfolio of development projects. And we reflected back this conclusion to him, and he said, the study made me think how reactionary I am for most of the time. In his case, he spent 15% of his time, 15% of his working week, his working hours, actually doing what he wanted to do, rather than fighting fires. I'm just wondering in the audience whether this sounds familiar. But the hope for him was in the way he phrased this. The study made me think. He was becoming self-aware. The third distinctive behavior pattern was a leaning to relationship. Originally, I called it a bias to relationship, but recent work on cognitive biases has meant that the word bias now has got a negative connotation. So we call this leaning to relationships. Again, we were very interested in how people use their discretionary time. Their use of discretionary time was an indicator of what they thought was important, what they thought was a priority. Now, this is what we discovered among the majority, the control group. In terms of task-oriented activities, their discretionary time, such as it was, they spent 89% on stuff. Now, that's to be expected because that's what books say that I, among other people, have written about how you manage projects. Only 11% was towards people-oriented activities. So what was the proportion of discretionary time of the high performers devoted to relationships? It was this. It was almost flipped. In fact, it varied from people-oriented being 40% at the low end to 80% of their discretionary time at the high end. I mean, I was so shocked by this. I asked one high performer, but what about your plans? What about your reports? And he said, yeah, I'd do that anyway. But the really important stuff was this. This is a quote from one of our telephone interviews with a high performer at the end. This is an interim program manager who worked for a communications company. That is a program manager who would be hired in to fill a vacancy until they could recruit a permanent program manager. Notice the phrasing here, and I quoted him verbatim. I made it my business. This is conscious. This is deliberate. I made it my business when I arrived here to immerse myself. This is deep thinking again, in the business community, to understand who was who. In other words, this program manager was prioritizing their stakeholders and how they functioned. He was adjusting his working styles to how they functioned. He was adjusting his messaging to how they functioned. He was adjusting the length of his engagement to how they functioned. The fourth behavior trait I just want to talk about today, and there are a few others, but these are the four main ones, is self-awareness. We know from the work on emotional intelligence that self-awareness is a key to functioning in a high-performing way. And our research question was, do these people have a mental crib sheet? So we asked them, what are your top 5? And it was amazing to me that most of the majority couldn't even reach 5. But all of the high performers could rattle them off. This was something they were rehearsing day in, day out. It was indicative that these people were students of their own thought narratives. In fact, some of them even journaled and kept their own reflections on how the day had gone, what decisions they'd made, how had they gone badly, what could they do different next time. This is really owning one's own self-development. Now, this is Dr. Norman Wood, who used to head up the Major Projects Authority of the UK government. Now, the Major Projects Authority is a big deal. At the time Dr. Wood was presiding over it, it accounted for £54 billion of public investment in these major projects. And of course, in the public sector, when you fail very publicly. You fail visibly. And this had a lot of political interest behind it. Dr. Wood's challenge was to make sure that there were early warning signs if some of these projects were going off the rails. I got to meet her at the Treasury when we took over a group of clients from the Central Bank of Brazil. And it was just one little remark she made that really set off a train of inquiry for me. At the time, she had commissioned, I think it was her, the government anyway, had commissioned something called the MPLA, the Major Projects Leadership Academy. And it was, the bid was won by Deloitte's and Side Business School of Oxford. And they constructed a program to take these high-flying public servant project and program managers through a program of mentorship, learning, buddying, and challenge. And she said the big revelation for her was the module on personal mastery. That is, how do you lead yourself? And that set me off on the journey to write my latest book. Now, here's the hope for the rest of us, how you and I can become top flight. And I suspect because you've signed into this webinar, you're already getting this. You're leaning into your own learning. How do we move up the scale? How do we become expert in our field, as it were, in the way that the Dreyfus brothers defined it? Well, one of my recommendations is to be counterintuitive. You see, the novice will always be the rule follower. The advanced beginner will be in danger of being a legalist, saying, that's not what Prince 2 says. That's not what PMI or PMBOK says. That's not what the APM body of knowledge says. Be counterintuitive. We live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment now in this century. Also embrace the bigger picture. This is a diagram from my Practical People Engagement book. You see, back in the 70s, when I first started project managing, it was all around the central circle, the orange zone there. It was all very much an engineering worldview. Real people just got in the way. But now, I think the challenge is not to discard anything in that orange circle. We still need to, in a sense, manage them, but we need to engage in leadership in the outer green circle. So we need to have a bigger picture. We need, as the Dreyfus brothers said with the proficient, to have a more holistic view. And also, with two of these behavior traits, for example, leaning to people and leaning to action, I presented it here as the value ladder. Supporting a journey we can take our customers through. Most project managers feel jobs done at delivery. Is it really? I think Agile has gone a long way to begin to challenge that. Really, it's about helping our customers achieve their business case. We need to help them deliver, receive what we deliver. We need to help them practice and use what we deliver. And we need to help them embed it so that it just becomes the new normal that they don't notice anymore. So have we been focusing on the wrong things? I think we have. If you look at really good pieces of work like the APM Competence Directory, it's great, it's really comprehensive, but it's very monolithic. It doesn't give you a clue as to the priority areas. I believe that these are some of the priority areas. And the good news is we can learn these behaviors. Hannah.
Thank you, Patrick, for delivering.
Hannah. Yeah.
Thank you for delivering this great presentation. So before we proceed with the Q&A session, I would like to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 21500 Lead Project Manager. This standard helps you in delivering projects successfully and ensuring a sustainable future. For more information, please visit our website, www.pcb.com/training. Now, I would like to proceed by answering some of the questions asked by the audience. The first question is there an ideal mindset that effective project managers should adopt, or is a contingency approach preferable?
Sorry, Hannah, I muted my microphone. Could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, sure. Is there an ideal mindset that effective project managers should adopt, or is a contingency approach preferable?
I think the answer to that is yes. We need to be inclusive both of contingency and what I would call a positive growth mindset. You'll see at the bottom of the screen there's a URL where I explain that in more detail. If you go to that page, you can download a free paper on 7 keys to exceptional performance. It's not an either or, it's a both and.
Thank you, Patrick. Another question that we have is, what leadership styles do top-flight project managers use?
They use all of them. If you're looking at situational leadership, for example, one of the advantages of the proficient and expert mindsets is they're able to be fairly agile in their style. They will pull it in very much on a contextual basis. To look for a single style is likely to exhaust the results you get from it in all situations.
Thank you, Patrick. Another question is, how do you mitigate problems when your team has agreed on project deadlines and objectives and management does not agree?
That's really down to good stakeholder engagement. I think part of it is to make sure that adequate costs are reflected back to senior management. And that isn't just about hard attributable costs, but the human costs, the delay, and so on. But also the team needs to be somewhat engaged with this as well. The team needs to understand this, and good leadership really invites people to look beyond that difficulty to the ultimate outcome. It's really taking that unwelcome news. I suspect that question's got a story behind it. I'm very happy to receive comments through that email on that particular context. But I would say that going in with an open mind and engaging senior management, but also being fairly transparent with your team about that, that yeah, things haven't gone as well as we'd hoped, but we're looking towards an end game here, which is beyond just what we had planned.
Thank you, Patrick. Another question that we have is, what qualities are most important for a project manager to be an effective project leader?
I think you'll find that in the downloadable resource. I haven't mentioned too much the work of Carol Dweck, who has written and researched extensively on something called the growth mindset. Sometimes it all starts with what you believe about yourself. Do you believe yourself to be a fixed quantity, or do you believe yourself as somebody who can grow and achieve more? So that's a very complex question, but I think we're beginning to identify some key driver skills, if you will, in the plural. These are skills which make learning things like latest regulations, complying to latest regulations, if you're, for example, a web developer, on disability access, quite trivial, because these other skills will help you cover and learn those very quickly. It isn't about content. It is about becoming a high order performer, and leadership has to be part of it. Napoleon once said that that leaders are brokers of the future. I like that. And if we're anything in our profession, we are deliverers of better future.
Thank you, Patrick. Because of time limitation, we will only be answering one more questions, while the rest of the questions will be answered by Patrick via email. So the question is, do you think that in order to be a good project manager, you need to have a good understanding of artificial intelligence?
Oh, Well, that would rule me out, I think. I think there does come a humility, for example, that you don't know and you're aware of your incompetence. But artificial intelligence, I'd be interested to know why you're coming at it from that point of view. It's interesting that the Dreyfus brothers, Simon and Hubert Dreyfus, published a book in the 80s around the subject of whether machines would make us redundant. And of course, we're beginning to see that narrative played out again with AI. But no, I'm not sure I see that. I think there is always going to be something transcendently powerful about you and I, human beings. I haven't seen the movie yet. One of my favorite movies was Blade Runner, but I understand that there's a narrative in the latest new version of Blade Runner that suggests that we can be less human because robots will be so much better at being human than we are. I'm not sure I buy into that.
Okay, Patrick, so I want to thank you once again for delivering this presentation today. It was an honor having you as a presenter. I would also like to thank all the attendees for joining us in this webinar. Please be reminded that this webinar will be recorded and posted in our YouTube channel and also in our SlideShare account. We hope you enjoyed this webinar and we wish you a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us.